Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Technology has become a battlefield for US-China competition. Last week, we saw a US congressional hearing where Zhou Shouzi, the CEO of TikTok, one of the most popular social media platforms, was questioned for hours for the company's ties to its Chinese parent, ByteDance. Over the last few years, we've seen more US government policies putting restrictions on Chinese technology companies, whether it's through export control or outright bans in the name of national security. While these policies may seem relatively new in the US, they're almost the norm in China when it comes to non-Chinese companies' access to the market. Reciprocity is the principle driving much of today's decoupling. Today, we'd like to speak to Rui Ma, one of the most astute observers of US-China technology ecosystem. She's based in San Francisco, close to many technology entrepreneurs, innovators, and investors who've been doing business between US and China. She also lived and worked in China. Welcome, Rui.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, what is the big deal with TikTok? Can you help us understand what's the issue? Why does Washington, D.C. really want to ban TikTok? And will the government actually ban TikTok completely?
Well, I think right now the main concern is, as you correctly pointed out, on TikTok's Chinese ownership. So the company is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese internet company, and the political leaders in the US basically point to this one Chinese law that would require ByteDance to help Chinese authorities in intelligence and national security matters if it were ever asked to. And they believe that this will also extend to TikTok, the subsidiary. So the push is to ban TikTok in the US, and it's largely led by Republican lawmakers, for what it's worth, who are concerned that ByteDance could be using user data to track the browsing history, location of US users, and could also use the massively popular platform to drive potential misinformation efforts.
I think it makes sense. Yeah, it does make sense, especially given, a couple years ago, how much Russian influence it sort of, intervened in the elections. But in terms of tracking and, sort of having access to American citizen data, why does it matter when actually I think a lot of Americans today don't even care that much about it, because it just seems that data breach or privacy is almost impossible in today's technology wired world.
Well, that is exactly one of the main arguments that this TikTok CEO mentioned again and again at the hearing, right? That TikTok's data collection methods do not differ from those of its competitors. So, like Facebook and other social media apps, TikTok collects much of the same data. Therefore, it could seem that, TikTok is being singled out again because of its Chinese ownership and not really because of its data collection practices. Also, as many other analysts have pointed out, American data is actually being sold kind of freely all over the world, including to Chinese entities by data brokers, because that aspect of our data privacy is not very well regulated at all.
That is a surprise to me. That sounds more concerning to me, if that is indeed the case. And what's also interesting is just how popular TikTok really is in the US. And actually, according to the Wall Street Journal, just over the weekend, a few other Chinese apps, from TikTok, Temu to Shein, some of these are e-commerce platforms. They're extremely popular among young Americans. And while they may not be as well known as TikTok in terms of its ties to China, but it doesn't seem that our young Americans are really concerned about its Chinese ties or privacy or data security. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, like I said, I think part of it is because the nature of these apps, right? TikTok is a social media platform where effectively, by definition, the information you're putting on the platform, for the most part, unless you're counting private messages, are basically being broadcast out to the world. So you actually want people to see your content. That is the whole point of being on this platform. Therefore, the users who choose to be on these platforms to upload their content probably aren't that concerned about privacy. As for the e-commerce platforms you talked about, I think that's even less of a concern because this is just people, buying their everyday items or fast fashion or what have you. This doesn't seem particularly invasive.
And why do you think they seem to be so popular among the young people? Do you think in terms of the apps themselves, they're actually better built than their American competitors?
Well, if I were to quote the Wall Street Journal article that you had just mentioned, that was written over the weekend, it is because these apps actually are better operated and better designed. And that is because the domestic Chinese market has been very competitive over the last 2 decades, most especially over the last 5 to 10 years with the advent of mobile internet and how extremely popular that has been in China. So because of the massive amount of competition, within Chinese borders, these companies have honed, their app making abilities to be really top notch, really world class. Therefore, when they bring their products abroad, they've been able to win users very easily.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think most of the world actually realize that, right? Because people still think of China as, copycats. And so can you kind of, just based on what you've been working on over the last, decade or so between US and China, just in terms of the evolution of China's technology sector, from copycat to innovator, we can call them this way. What has really changed, in terms of the nature of US-China relationship when it comes to technology, collaboration or competitor today, to describe the nature of that relationship?
Yeah, so China definitely still lags the US on a lot of technological fronts, but it does lead in a few select, especially consumer internet sectors. So e-commerce is one of them, gaming is one of them, social media also one of them. And we can trace
Is
the
it
roots.
because their market is so massive that, the competition is so fierce, so naturally you just, have the best almost coming out of the most fierce competition?
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. I think so again, going back to the fact that mobile internet in China is the internet, unlike in the US where we had, PC penetration go up to pretty high before smartphones came about. China didn't really have that, right? So China had half the PC penetration of the US. And it was at a much lower level in terms of infrastructure before in 2010 or so when smartphones really started to enter China. The iPhone was invented a few years prior. And by the time 2011 rolled around, China already became the largest smartphone shipment market in the world. And very quickly, mobile internet just took over. So when we talk about a lot of the places that China's leading in, it's really from this one, change in paradigm and technological paradigms that where China started to find an edge. When it comes to e-commerce and gaming, I would say for e-commerce in particular, there's a huge difference between, again, the US market and Chinese market. Whereas in the US, you had, offline retail had a head start, like over 150 years ago is when you really start to see sophisticated offline retail pop up. For China, that really wasn't the case until 40 years ago or so when the economy started to open up. So you have this weird thing where in the US, e-commerce is really sort of offline transitioning and transforming digitally to online. And in China, you have actually, there was no robust offline retail ecosystem. So e-commerce was sort of one of the main ways you can get goods in China, and therefore it's has a much higher penetration rate. It's a much larger market, and it's much more sophisticated for that reason, because it's not, the second stage or the evolution of something that existed prior. It was sort of like the birth of retail happening all at once in China, offline, online, and because online is much faster to build out, it happened in a much bigger way online.
What about beyond consumers and e-commerce?
For young, do you mean why apps such as Shein and Temu have done so well in the US?
Well, no, in terms of between the two countries, right? Beyond sort of the evolution over the last 20 years or so, the dynamics or the relationship between the two countries. I still remember when there was a lot of R&D collaboration, even on AI, right? Until pretty much very recently, it was not really viewed as a national security issue or a competition. Whereas you have two countries, experts who literally are working together to develop. That just doesn't seem to be possible today.
Yeah, on a collaboration level, I think that in R&D and science R&D, it's still happening, but it is definitely decreasing by the day, especially in some of the sectors that, your viewers might be familiar with. Obviously, semiconductors, obviously, some of the deep tech that could be dual use. I was just reading actually right before this interview as I was preparing that, life sciences, there's still quite a robust collaborative effort. And that's just because China has such a huge population. You can imagine that someone doing a drug trial for a rare disease just has a higher chance of finding, a significant number of patients in China and would be able to conduct those trials and get their drugs faster to market. In fact, one of the cancer drugs I was reading about cut down a 10 to 15 year cycle that's typical for the drug. When they started enrolling Chinese patients, they were able to reduce that down to 2 to 3 years, which is very, very significant. So I think collaborations like that, scientists are still vigorously trying to defend and to make sure they still happen. But in some of these other areas that have been identified by both governments, frankly, as highly sensitive, I think that's going to become harder and harder.
Yeah, but if you remember, I mean, just a couple of years ago in the Trump administration, when they started imposing restrictions on Chinese technology companies' investments and expansion into the US, I would say most people in the business and investment community kind of thought it would not have been possible. But it seems like the Biden administration has continued and even expanded the scope. So, do you feel like decoupling is really happening? I feel like it just a couple years ago, people kind of didn't think that's possible, but it feels like it may be actually happening.
I think it's absolutely happening. CFIUS was one of the things that really changed a lot of things from the investment front, at least, because CFIUS has the right to review, any transaction involving foreign entities. By the way, it doesn't have to be Chinese. It could be any foreign entity. But, China is probably one of the ones that they pay a lot of attention to. And China used to be one of the most active investors. So I can say from personal experience that, back in 2015, 16, there were many Chinese investors looking to deploy capital here in Silicon Valley. And that has basically decreased to nothing. So as far as I know, no one's really doing it at scale. Maybe a few individuals are still doing deals, but no large organizations or institutions are really trying to deploy large amounts of capital because it has become too onerous, the reporting requirements and the uncertainty around getting these transactions approved.
So what about the opposite direction? Are you seeing the decrease in terms of investment and interest from the US to China as well?
I think that is definitely also happening, but I think that is lagging, right? So from the US to China side, there was quite a robust ecosystem of, venture capital firms, primarily, since we're talking about technology, that were funded by US institutions and then headed up by often, Chinese nationals or maybe returnees investing into the Chinese tech ecosystem. That has slowed down. It slowed down a little bit prior to the market slowdown that we saw. So the market, the poor market conditions do play into it. But I do believe that going forward, we're going to see less and less because there is immense pressure on some of these, especially larger institutions, for ESG reasons, not to put money into China. And also just the uncertainty around if we're investing in technology, are new restrictions going to come down where, limited partners are going to have to be responsible for more reporting or more reviews of their investments? That's just something no one really wants to be involved in or do. Why do that when you can chase returns elsewhere in the world or in other sectors here in the US?
Yeah, but it seems like some investors are still very gung-ho on investing in China. And what's also interesting is that, we're seeing some Chinese companies, or I should say companies headquartered in China, setting up, new entities or separate entities in Singapore or elsewhere in order to access capital and expand globally without looking like a Chinese company, right? Or they would intentionally sort of hide where their headquarters is. Like I remember Shein was doing that, even though it's, started in Guangzhou, but moved and relocated. And the founder even, considered, I don't know if it happened or not, changing his citizenship. And, do all these things make them safer?
It's really hard to know. I think right now, well, as we already discussed at the beginning of this session, it doesn't seem like consumers care, right? So if we're going by, what the politicians, when lawmakers and policymakers may be concerned about, I'm not sure that would be sufficient. First of all, we already see a much more expansive restrictive act, fittingly called the Restrict Act, targeted towards companies from China, as well as several other foreign countries the US considers to be adversaries. And those restrictions, if passed, could be quite sweeping. Reading the text, again, I'm not a legal expert, but they seem to encompass many, many more sectors than just, quote unquote, sensitive technologies, e-commerce and gaming, fairly innocuous sectors are included in those. So I think that it could be very difficult going forward. While right now, maybe, it doesn't raise any red flags, I'm not sure that structure going forward is going to be as robust as some of these founders think.
Yeah. What's also interesting, I think, for the audience to know is that in the US, there appears to be sort of, a group of investors led by, a very powerful investor and political donor, Peter Thiel and his friends, and some of the others to push Washington, D.C. really hard to have more bans on Chinese technology companies. And you would typically think, oh no, Silicon Valley, should be advocating for doing more business with China because for a long time that was the norm. So why do you think that's the case? What is the motivation behind their advocacy?
So I don't have any particular insight into exactly why he's doing this, but if I had to hazard a guess, I think it has to do with economic interests, right? So these are investors, and at the end of the day, they care about the amount of value they're getting from their activities. And for funds like Founders Fund, for Peter Thiel in particular, obviously he was one of the main original shareholders of Facebook, which is one of the companies that's suffering probably the most from the expansion of TikTok into the US. His fund and many other funds in Silicon Valley in recent years have also gotten a lot bigger in terms of investments into defense tech. So having, restrictive or maybe an openly hostile relationship with China could be very good for those portfolio companies. So maybe I'm thinking a little too much, but I think those could be very, very valid concerns.
Yeah, so they're basically taking a position that companies without ties to China would be more investable. Sounds like that's the position they're taking. It's all fascinating to me, obviously. And I wanted to talk about sort of, concerns, right? A lot of the US government actions are, such in the name of national security and economic security. As someone, who's not in the government work, do you think this is benefiting US technology innovation in the long run? Or do you feel like this is actually going to hurt our innovation by this kind of government intervention?
Well, I largely support more government regulation in terms of, privacy, data security, all these things. I don't support them with, China as a target for these concerns and not, having the rules be broadly applied to all companies providing technology here. I think that overall, a very protectionist stance is not going to be good for innovation, right? That's just largely not happened in history, broadly speaking. I think that we can already see that the expansion of TikTok into the US has already had some effects on Facebook, which is honestly, if you think about it, sort of a monopolistic business in its space. But when TikTok came and brought with it short video, which is sort of a paradigm change, Facebook had to compete, and we can see that it's made a lot of changes to the product, primarily to Instagram. But some of those changes have been good. Some of those changes maybe not so great, but it's been forced to innovate and be make a lot more changes to the product than it otherwise would have, I think, personally, and that we saw in the years before.
Yeah, and are there other unintended consequences? And I'll be very specific about this, as you said, right? It's almost like a China-specific kind of approach. Are you concerned about discrimination against Chinese Americans, especially because so many of them actually work in Silicon Valley in technology sector and have been key players between Silicon Valley and Beijing's Zhongguancun over the past 2 decades or so? Are you personally worried about that?
Absolutely. I think the anti-China sentiment is very much problematic, especially for Chinese Americans, but broadly speaking for all Asian Americans, because let's face it, not everyone takes the time to figure out, what kind of Asian you are, right? They just look at you and they say, oh, East Asian, and could definitely
are you
do some harmful
experiencing that,
things.
or have you witnessed or have you heard stories of personal stories?
Yes, for sure. I think I think that the most public stories, if anyone cares to find out, they've been broadly reported now, which is related primarily to the China initiative and really involves academics, in the technology fields. I don't have too many friends in academia, so I can't say I have, friends who've gone through that firsthand. But on the investor side, that's also happened. I know plenty of people who have either voluntarily or I would really like to use the word involuntarily dropped out of their bicultural, bilingual, cross-border career because of concerns. And because of maybe some of them were harassed by media, some of them were harassed by competitors, some of them were harassed by maybe just people poking around and asking many questions. And, they decided that it wasn't worth the effort to try to constantly explain what they're doing because as you probably know from hosting this program, a lot of details when you're doing cross-border work get lost or mistranslated, and it can come across as, as shady when it's actually very innocent. So I definitely know people who have, changed careers, or I was actually just speaking to a founder who had to go through a very intensive CFIUS process. And then she decided that for her next startup, she's never going to do anything that would trigger any kind of investigation or review, I should say. It wasn't an investigation, it was a review, because she found it such a waste of time and just honestly so traumatic.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's burdensome, right? Even if, the review process in the end may not result in anything negative, but still it is burdensome to a lot of the businesses. So where is this all headed in your prediction?
Well, I hope that, cooler heads prevail and, both sides, that this quote unquote decoupling doesn't go to the most extreme, which is, a very, very severe and complete cutoff. I hope that the policymakers can have sort of more long-term have a more long-term mentality in mind when they think about how to separate national security interests and consumer interests and investor interests also, and include not just this like fear or threat when they're making decisions, right? Because like as giving an example about the cancer drug earlier, there are lots of good things that come out of collaboration. And in today's world, I would argue with, our very advanced products, very long supply chains and very fluid people moving back and forth across borders, globalization is a good thing. It's very sad to me that somehow this has been painted as a risk or somehow evil or undesirable.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always refreshing to hear your kind of, I would just say, common sense kind of point of view, rather than a very DC centric perspectives. And like you said, hopefully the cool heads prevail. And because ultimately we want the consumers, right, to benefit most from whether it's innovation or just having exposure and the options of the best products. So thank you and take care.
Thank you.